I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. As we begin to prepare for calving 2020, dairy specialist Martina Gormley asks the question, have you sufficient space in your existing calf rearing facilities? But first I asked her about the expected number of dairy calvings next year.
So we're looking at nearly 1.5 million dairy calvings for 2020. So this is an increase of about 300,000 calvings since 2014. Now, 1.5 million dairy calvings may seem like a lot, but really we are only now back to the numbers in terms of dairy cow numbers that we had in 1984. But the difference now is that these cows are being farmed on fewer farms, which is causing an increase in workload and also putting pressure on facilities for some farms. When we look then in terms of the months when these cows are calving, we are seeing that the majority, just around 1 million cows, are calving from January to the end of March. But really working with farmers on the ground, we can see that they really are putting a lot of work and planning in place in terms of catering for all the calves on the farm. Not just the extra calves due to increasing cow numbers, but all the calves on the farm.
And I think, you've alluded to it in terms of the concentration of calvings. So, 1 million. So, 66% of these calves will calve in the first 3 months of the year. And this is something that has been talked about in the media, for several weeks, putting farmers under pressure, putting accommodation under pressure. Like, what's your take on that, Martina?
So I think, Emma-Louise, we need to first look at, the advantages in terms of, compact calving. The ones that stand out to me are your solids, okay, in terms of achieving higher solids within the year. Replacements, in terms of having more replacements, and ease of heifer management is a really big one, a big benefit from compact calving. Lower feed costs, and also I think what we forget sometimes is that there's going to be fewer weeks of calf rearing and also fewer weeks of watching cows calving down. So they are really beneficial advantages. So we're not just throwing out figures to challenge people. It's because they're really beneficial. Now, I think we also need to look at the different calving patterns that are out there, and there's a few different combinations. But when you look at any calving pattern, it has the potential to be a nightmare if you're not prepared for it. And I think that's a really important point. So, for example, if we take a spring, a calving pattern that is spread out. So you're going to have cows calving in May and June and maybe in July as well. So what this is going to do, it's going to increase the risk of disease on farm because calves are going to be in sheds longer. And it's also going to lead to burnout for many farmers because of the increase in terms of the number of weeks they are calving cows and rearing calves. Then if you look at, I suppose, what some farmers have done is started calving pre-Christmas. Again, just another version of trying to reduce this peak calving. But in that scenario, what you're doing is you are increasing the work then in January and February. And what you're also doing is you're eliminating the opportunity or the time to prepare and plan ahead for the calves that are coming. So I think when you weigh it all up and you look at the different calving patterns, really the most efficient option is compact calving. But it does come with health warnings, particularly around having sufficient accommodation for calves, and also in terms of best practice in terms of your heifer rearing. If we look at the farmers that have a high 6-week calving rate, what you'll see is that they will be quite busy in December and January because they'll be making changes to, for example, say pinning for calves. They will be reflecting back, they'll have that time to reflect back and look at, what were the things that bugged them the year before. And they will be, making some small changes that will help them for the calving season ahead.
I think you've made some really good points there, Martina, particularly around, looking back to last year or looking back over the last few years, what didn't work during the calving season. And, I think the comment has been made before, the people who are working on labour like yourself, Abigail Ryan, Marion Beecher, would always say that it's a busy period, it's a stressful period on farms, and we do need to learn from what didn't work well in previous years. And you've identified it well too, where you have a compact calving from, say, the 1st of February or that, December, January is a quiet period that gives you the opportunity to prepare. I think for another aspect of what you've mentioned is compact calving, concentrates the busy period. And for the operator, I think that's really important. It's a lot easier to calve over a 3-month period than a 6-month period, from the operator's perspective, reduce stress and burnout for the operator. And, it's a significant, commitment for a shorter period of time. One thing you're mentioning when you talk about the concentration of calving, Martina, is the 6-week calving rate. So how are we there nationally? I know we're increasing over the last number of years.
So I think, Emma-Louise, a lot of people will be surprised at the figure, the national figure at the minute. So it's 65%. So 65% of the cows are calving in the first 6 weeks. Now, this has only gone from, an increase of 6% if you look back 6 years ago. So that's a 1% increase per year over the last 6 years. So we really are a long way from the target of 80%. And I think that would surprise a lot of people. However, what we need to look at within this average, there's going to be a range. So you will have some farms that will be calving cows, 30% of them in the first 6 weeks, and then of course, you're going to have the upper end of some farms that are pushing it out because of all the advantages, to 85% or 90%. So I think an important thing to look at is in terms of the peak calf numbers then, okay? So if we take 100 cow herd, okay, going from the national average figure, which is 65%, to let's say 80%, that's creating a difference of around 15 calves. Okay, and if you put that back in terms of accommodation, again, just depending on your depth of your pen, but you're looking at one bay or 1.5 bays. Okay, so I think we really need to put it into perspective. And I think that this upgrade in terms of accommodation for all the benefits is very achievable for many farms, and I see on the ground a lot of farms who have put this extra bit of accommodation in place.
In terms then, Martina, I think you've made a really good point. For every 100 cows increasing from the national average of a 65% 6-week calving rate up to the target that you're setting of 80, that's 15 calves. If we look at the national average herd, there's about 90 cows in it. So you're talking between 10 and 15 cows, in that herd. If we look then to calf housing and what you've been discussing, what are the key principles for design of calf accommodation?
So there are a few different key principles, but I think if we focus on 3 principles in particular, we will design very good accommodation. So I think firstly it's ventilation. So that's your inlet and your outlet in terms of air coming in and coming out of the shed, which is really, really important. And then moving on from that is it in terms of cleaning. So can the shed be mechanically cleaned? And if it can't, you're going to run into a situation where hygiene is going to be quite poor, and hygiene is critical for calf rearing. So the accommodation has to be, to be able, you need to be able to mechanically clean the accommodation you have. And I think the third one then is the slope of the floor. So the slope needs to be correct in order to allow a fall for the runoff in order for the calf to have a dry bed. If you can't meet these three requirements, then really that accommodation shouldn't be counted. If you can get these three design principles right, you really are a long way there to having good accommodation that will allow for less calf health issues and therefore less labour. There are some really good examples of sheds out there that have modified their existing sheds, to improve ventilation and reduce drafts. Some simple ideas that I see going from farm to farm would be things like, opening out the side sheeting of the shed, or adding a hinged board to the back wall of the shed where there's been drafts, and the calf can lie in under that. And I really think at this stage it's not too late to make changes, and some small changes that don't cost much will greatly reduce calf health and labour on the farm for the calving season ahead.
I think they're really good and basic practical points that you're making there, Martina. The ventilation, so air moving in and out of the shed, being actually able to mechanically clean the sheds. Like if it's a manual job, it's not going to be done as regularly. And then look, a slope in the floor to allow for the runoff. Just in terms of looking at our existing calf housing facilities on farm, if we just look at our own individual situations, how can we calculate whether our calf housing is sufficient or not?
Okay, so I think there's three main steps to this. And, they're quite simple steps, but they're really important to actually go out and physically do it. So I think number one is actually go out and measure your current accommodation. So the length and the depth, or the width of each pen you have, or the accommodation that's there. Then divide this total figure by 1.7 metres squared. So 1.7 metres squared is the recommended calf space allowance for calves. And we need to be giving calves that space. Okay, they're growing animals, and that is the minimum requirement. From this, then you need to have a look at your scanning results, and roughly work out how many cows will have calved by the first week in March, which is really what we're seeing on the ground, is when the peak calves are on many farms.
And in terms then of your 1st of March, realistically, any of your surplus calves, so say if it's a concentrated dairy farm and you're not keeping any males, they may still be on the farm at that point.
Correct.
Then if we take then a step further, and last year some farms have piloted keeping calves for longer on the farm. Say, I suppose the minimum period is 10 days, but keeping them longer on farms. Is this an option?
Okay, so we have looked at a few different herds on farms that are quite compact, so 80% plus in the first 6 weeks, just to see in terms of the age of calving on average, what difference does that make. So again, if we go back to the 100 cow herd and we look at a farmer who's selling his or her surplus calves at on average 2 weeks of age, okay, which is very efficient, and then a farmer who is selling his surplus calves at 3 to 4 weeks of age, there's going to be a 15% difference there, or again 15 calves. Okay, so the farmer selling at 2 weeks of age on average his calves will need peak accommodation for 55 calves, where the other farmer selling his calves at 3 to 4 weeks of age will need accommodation for 70 calves. Okay, so again, you're back to, depending on the depth of the pens you have, but a bay and a half is what you're looking at there in terms of the difference. So peak calf space requirement, for just for a rule of thumb to remember, peak calf space requirement for 55 calves, or it's 55% of your total cow numbers if you are selling your surplus calves on average at 2 weeks of age. Whereas if you are selling your surplus calves for 3 to 4 weeks of age, it's 70% is the number you need multiply that by your total cow numbers, and you won't be too far off the mark.
And I think too, like an important point there would be that, people say, oh, I get the surplus calves off the farm at 2 weeks, but sometimes that can roll into 2.5 or 3 weeks, depending on where they're going, if a dry stock farmer is collecting them. So just to be conscious of that, you might be looking for 55 calves, but that might roll into 60 calves, depending on who you're dealing with.
Absolutely. And Emma-Louise, just going back to the number of farms that I would have, I suppose, analysed their selling pattern and that. And before the analysis, when I would have spoke to the farmer and asked, what do you think yourself in terms of, on average, age you're selling the calves? They thought it was a lot less than what it actually was after the analysis. So that showed that calves were waiting on the farm longer for whatever reason, and it also showed that they did have some more accommodation probably there than they actually thought.
And to take it a step further then, Martina, you're looking at anywhere between 55 and 70 calves, depending on when we're selling our surplus. Is there any way to reduce this peak calf accommodation number or requirement on farms?
Okay, so I suppose there is the perception out there that by not compacting your calving, that you will reduce calf peak accommodation required. And this is true to an extent, but it's only a very small reduction that comes with that. And, as we spoke about earlier, you are missing out on all the advantages. So it really is a non-runner. But I think, if we firstly maybe look at when peak calf numbers hit most farms, you are looking at in around the first week of March. So it's very hard to reduce this peak, because when you start calving cows, we'll say in early February, you're going to be keeping your replacement heifers from your early calving cows. And in between those calvings, you will have your calves that you will be selling. So while the minimum movement is 10 days at the minute, in reality, it's going to be the first week in March before you have a group of calves ready for sale. But the thing I would say now, it's not too late, Emma-Louise, to, do an audit of your calf accommodation. And then use either the guide of either 55% or 70% of your total cow numbers to determine your peak. And if there's a deficit there, now is the time to come up with a plan. And there is different options out there, and it's a matter of, choosing, I suppose, the most suitable for your farm, the deficit you have, and I suppose the time frame you have as well.
Super. Thanks, Martina. That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Martina Gormley for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.